Our next speaker is Sawyer Olmstead. So Sawyer is the provincial apiculturalist with the Nova Scotia Department of Agriculture. He's responsible for overseeing the health, regulation, and sustainable growth of the province's beekeeping industry, and primarily acting under the authority of the Bee Industry Act. So Sawyer supports the Nova Scotia Beekeepers Association and also works in conjunction with the Atlantic Tech Transfer Team for Apiculture, or ATA, to support research and technology transfer. And Sawyer is a graduate of Dalhousie Faculty of Agriculture, so welcome. That's your button for changing.
All right, can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay, awesome. So I guess with that introduction, I'll just kind of hop right into it. Maybe. There. All right. So I guess before I get started, for anyone who may be curious what I actually do on a day-to-day basis, generally anything that the provincial government does or is involved in with honeybees crosses my desk at some point or another. And I know it's very broad, but just to kind of distill it down to a few points, my major responsibility is to administer the Honeybee Industry Act and regulations. So the Honeybee Industry Act and regulations, there's a lot of pieces to that, but a few of the main things that I work on are maintaining a registry of all beekeepers in Nova Scotia. I draft annual import protocols and issue import permits for beekeepers who want to bring in bees from other parts of the country or other parts of the country or from other countries. And I conduct hive health assessments and surveys. I'm involved with extension outreach with the beekeepers. I disseminate fact sheets, best management practices, industry news, regulatory notices, stuff like that. I demonstrate best management practices while on farm. I assist with the delivery of some of the bee courses that happen in the province. And I assist with the development and delivery of bee-related programming. And I also coordinate with various agencies and NGOs. I work quite closely with the Nova Scotia Beekeepers Association. I represent Nova Scotia nationally with the Canadian Association of Professional Apiculturists. And I also work quite closely on bee-related things with CFIA, PMRA, Health Canada, Stats Canada, and other provincial agricultural departments. So this figure here, what I'm going to talk to you mostly today about is, the bee industry, the statistics, where we are for beekeepers, hive numbers, stuff like that. So what this figure shows the total number of beekeepers that we have in Nova Scotia over a 10-year period, so 2016 to 2025. So if you look at 2025, I'm not sure I guess the colors are showing up a little bit better on that screen than mine. But we have about 983 beekeepers registered in Nova Scotia as of March 2nd. When I present the stats to you today, all my numbers are current as of March 2nd. I like to try to keep things up to date within a couple weeks, but I was off with the kids for March break, so I'm a little bit behind. So as I said, we have 983 beekeepers registered in Nova Scotia for 2025 right now, but we are still missing some beekeepers, so I do suspect that we're going to hit over 1,000 beekeepers in the province this year, which is the most we've ever had. I mean, if you look at 2016, we had about 420 beekeepers, and now we're up to about 1,000. So in the past 10 years, we've had, quite remarkable growth. In terms of where beekeepers are actually located in Nova Scotia, this is a heat map. So what it shows is not, I guess, where the hives are located, but just where beekeepers are registered. So the heat map shows essentially the hotter the color, so the reds and the yellows and the whites there, indicates a higher density of beekeepers, and kind of the cooler colors like the purples is a lower density of beekeepers. So what you can see, there's a lot of beekeepers in the Halifax area. There's a pretty decent density of beekeepers up in Truro. And then we have beekeepers kind of down through the valley through, Windsor, Kentville, kind of all the way down to Digby and Yarmouth. A pretty good chunk of beekeepers out in New Glasgow area, and then another pretty good chunk in Cape Breton up in the Sydney area. So in terms of hive numbers, again, most of my figures show stats for the past 10 years. So where we're sitting right now in 2025 is about 29,000 or just over 29,000 hives that were operated in the summer in Nova Scotia, which is, And I guess, sorry, and as you know, these stats are current as of March 2nd. Based on who I know is missing from my registry, we're missing about 850 hives or so. So we have, 29,200 beekeepers registered, but I do suspect we're going to hit about 30,000 beekeepers by the time I track everybody down, which is about 1,000 hives less that were operated peak summer than last year, and similar to what we had in 2023. But what's most interesting, I guess, so our summer numbers were down a little bit, but the numbers going into winter are higher than they've ever been before, which is quite interesting. This year, we suspect we're going to have about 28,000 hives that are going to be going into winter, and this is about 1,000 more than last year, and about 1,500 more than the year before. So, I guess it just kind of goes to show that, the honeybee industry is continually growing. And in addition to the 28,000 full hives that are going into winter, beekeepers are putting in about 1,700 overwinter nukes as well, which we don't really count them in the hive numbers just because survival is a little bit more variable with the overwinter nukes. But if we have a good winter, they can come out and contribute to pollination as well. So I show this figure to the beekeepers all the time. They like to see it, so I figured you guys might find it interesting as well. So what it does, it breaks down the number of hives that we have, the number of the hives that beekeepers have based on the operation size. So we break it down to categories of 500 hives and up, 200 to 500, 100 to 200, 50 to 100, 10 to 50, and 0 to 9, or 0 to 10. And we work with the Nova Scotia Beekeepers Association to kind of figure out what categories I like to see. So probably not surprising, in the 500 hive plus category, there's 4 beekeepers that are kind of in that range. They operate about 64% of all the hives in the province, and they send 75% of the hives to blueberry pollination. So, the majority of the hives and the majority of the blueberry pollination is done by, the 4 biggest beekeepers in the province. And as we kind of scale down from there, we have 10 beekeepers in the 200 to 500 range. They run about 12 or 13% of all the hives in the province, and they send a pretty good chunk of hives, I guess 15% or so of the hives that go to blueberries. In the 100 to 200 range, again, 11 beekeepers. They operate fewer hives, so about 4.5% of the hives total in the province, and then they send about 3.5% of the hives that go to pollination. And I'll kind of stop there. There's some, beekeepers in the 50 to 100 range. So our commercial beekeepers, I guess, are defined as anyone keeping 50 hives or more. So, the people in the 50 to 100 range, they're still sending, a fairly decent amount of hives to blueberry pollination. But as you kind of scale down from there, in the 10 to 50 range, they're only sending 2% of all the hives in the province. And then the beekeepers who keep less than 10 hives, so there's, a lot of them, and they only send about 0.2% of the hive. So the small beekeepers, the ones with under 10 hives, really aren't contributing very much to pollination. So we have about 52 commercial beekeepers in Nova Scotia, so those are the beekeepers that have 50 hives and up. And those 50 beekeepers, they operate about 87% of the hives in the province, and they supply about 98% of all the hives that go to blueberries. So it really is the commercial beekeepers that are doing the majority of the work. So in terms of where hives are located, people find this pretty interesting. The vast majority, so I guess about half of all the hives in the province are located in Kings and Hants County, which is, not surprising. It's a kind of a great place to keep bees. There's about 3,000 hives that are kept in Annapolis and Digby County, about 5,600 up in Colchester and Cumberland, 2,300 out in Antigonish and Pictou, and then the rest of the counties kind of hold the rest. So there's about 800 hives in all of Cape Breton, about 200 hives in Guysborough, just shy of 800 in Halifax, which is kind of interesting because that's where the highest density of beekeepers is, but they're not really keeping a lot of hives. Queens and Lunenburg County is about 750, and then about 200 hives down in Yarmouth and Shelburne as well. So I do want to talk just quickly about overwinter losses. So what this figure shows is overwinter loss of hives across the country. So in Nova Scotia, and I guess how I set this up is, so any of the provinces that are green, they're below 20% over winter loss, which is generally kind of the upper limit of what's considered sustainable. So if a beekeeper has an 18% winter, or sorry, a 20% winter loss or less, they can generally recover that over winter loss without significant financial hardship. In the 20 to 30% loss range, those are, the yellow provinces. Those losses are a little bit, more acceptable. Beekeepers are still able to recover, but they're going to suffer some, financial hardship to kind of get back to where they were. Then anything red 30% and up, 30% loss or more is going to hurt. So anyone who had a 30% loss or more is going to, suffer significant financial hardship, I guess, to recover their losses. So the figure shows overall losses for 2025. So Nova Scotia last year had about 18.3% over winter loss, which is great. Similar to what our kind of long-standing average is. You can see the only other province there that was below 20% loss was Newfoundland and Labrador. I don't really like to count them. They're a very small industry. They have about 800 hives in all of Newfoundland and Labrador, and they're free of basically all pests and diseases. So it's really not hard, I guess, to keep bees alive in Newfoundland. But then, PEI, they did okay, 23%. Quebec was around 23% as well. And then everyone else, across the country had those high overwinter losses. So New Brunswick kind of led the way with losses around 45%. And then again, I don't need to read them all off. You can see them there, but, a lot in the, 40% and up. So just to show what, losses have been for the past 5 years, or 5-year average, again, Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, our 5-year average is pretty good. We're below the 20% mark. And actually our Nova Scotia's 10-year winter loss average is around 18%. So, 18's kind of been our number for a long time. And then as you look across the country, PEI for the past 5 years, their losses were okay last year, but their average is about 40%. Quebec's closer to 30, Saskatchewan's in the high 20s, and everyone else is 30 and above. So I guess, the reason why I wanted to show this is just to, provide the information that generally, Nova Scotia beekeepers are doing a pretty good job, and, I guess with Newfoundland as well, are kind of leading the country for overwinter loss in a good way. This figure shows honey production over time for the past 10 years. So the blue bar you can see there is average yield per hive in pounds. And then the red line is the number of hives that beekeepers report using for honey production. So in 2025, average yield was about 38 pounds a hive, which honestly is better than I thought, to be completely honest. For the bee industry, it was looking like honey production was going to be a bumper crop year. And then when the drought hit, things just kind of turned horrible, and bees didn't make any more honey from that point. They actually consumed a bunch. So I am kind of surprised that we ended up as good as we did. But 38 pounds is similar to what we've seen for the past 3 to 4 years. And our honey yield, or beekeepers' honey yield for the past 3 to 4 years has been down about 22% on average from our kind of long-standing average. So typically, when beekeepers would expect to make about 50 pounds of honey per hive, and we've been closer to that 40 pound per hive mark for quite some time, which has been a challenge for the industry. And I guess provincially, overall honey production ticked up just a little bit last year compared to previous years, and that's just because the total number of hives used for honey production was up a little bit last year. So our total yield is a function of average yield times the number of hives used for honey production. So we did, I guess, make it a little bit more last year than the last couple of years, but that's just because we had more hives doing it. I don't really need to talk to you guys about the impacts of the drought. I know you feel it just the same as everybody else. But what I wanted to show is some of the data that we collected from beekeepers on our annual renewal survey. So there's a lot of information here. I'm not going to kind of take the time to focus on everything, but generally, what this shows is the darker The darker green bars, so I guess what this shows is we asked the questions to beekeepers, how the drought impacted them. So they record if they strongly agree, if the response was neutral, they disagree, or strongly disagree. Um, so the dark green, the light green bars there show agree and strongly agree. The gray bars are neutral, and then the red or pink bars there are disagree. So generally what commercial beekeepers told us is the major impacts of the drought were the decrease in honey production, increase in, in feeding costs, some, decrease in honey revenue, which is certainly tied to yield. But what's, I guess, important to show, what I wanted to show, is there wasn't a lot of agreement to, the question of if the 2025 drought is going to decrease pollination revenue. So although beekeepers were kind of hit by low honey yields last year, which certainly impacted their business, beekeepers didn't think, I guess, or didn't agree that the drought was going to impact pollination in any way, which is good. So, I know you guys probably aren't very super interested in kind of the nitty gritty of our provincial inspections, but what I just wanted to show was, generally on our inspections, we look at 750 to 1,000 hives every year, and we're not finding a lot. When we do our inspections, in terms of pests and diseases, we're pretty happy with what we see. Our pest and disease profile in Nova Scotia is quite good. And I guess for the past, 5 or 10 years, that's kind of the trend. So we are quite happy with what we see. Beekeepers are doing a good job, in terms of managing pests and diseases. I'm sure everyone in the room is interested in this. This is just a slide on pollination. The table there at the bottom includes, pollination numbers for other crops. We have about 500 hives that go to highbush blueberries, about 400 go to apples, 400 cranberries, and 200 strawberries, and a few go to haskap. But as you can see, kind of the lion's share of the hives in Nova Scotia do go to pollinate lowbush blueberries. So in 2025, we had 70 beekeepers provide pollination services to lowbush blueberries, which interestingly is up about 19 or 20 people, which is interesting to see. And I mean, it's a good trend as well. So in Nova Scotia, we expect that local hives, about 19,000 went to blueberries last year. And then we had obviously the 864 imported colonies that provided pollination services as well. So, provincially, we were around 20,000 hives used for pollination last year. Average rental fee was $193 a hive, which was down a little bit from the year before, but I'm still missing a couple beekeepers in there. So once I get their data, I'm assuming that my average is going to be pretty close to what it was the year before. And I do get questioned quite a bit on kind of how we compare, how our Nova Scotia enterprise compares to other areas. So I asked my counterparts, PAs in New Brunswick and PEI, for this data just to see what their beekeepers are reporting as their average revenue from pollination. So as you can see, Nova Scotia kind of trails behind in pollination revenue across the maritime provinces. Both New Brunswick and PEI are around that 225 to 230 a hive mark, and Nova Scotia is just below 200. And when you're talking to, I guess, growers and blueberry growers in the other provinces, you'll probably hear that what they paid for pollination was higher than what these numbers are. And that's just because what these numbers are the numbers that local beekeepers reported getting paid, I guess. But there certainly is quite a bit of quite a number of hives that are imported into a New Brunswick and PEI to service their pollination demand. So we don't really have the good data, I guess, on what those rental costs are. But I do hear that generally it is adding the brokerage fee in there does end up being higher than what these averages are. So I do want to talk about our importation pilot project from last year. Just a quick review on it. As I mentioned, 864 hives came into the province under the pilot project last year, and they were permitted to go to Cumberland County only. before the hives come into the province, they were inspected by inspectors in the province of origin, and they met the rigorous guidelines set out in our import protocol. So the hives arrived in Cumberland County on May 28th, and they were inspected by us, department inspectors, on June 2nd. So we looked at we looked at 180 of these hives, which is about 21% of them. And we did full brood inspections and top bar inspections, so we looked at basically everything in that 21%. And then we looked at about 5% of them as well for varroa mites. And, generally, I can't really get in kind of the nitty gritty of what we found, but, we didn't find anything of concern. We didn't find small hive beetles, American foul brood, European foul brood. We found the common bee diseases at, low acceptable levels, and, we were quite happy with the pest and disease profile of the hives that came in. So these hives, they did leave the province before the deadline of July 1st. And then I gave an update, I guess, on how the pilot project went to the main stakeholders that were involved in the border consultation on July 7th. So for 2026, this year, the import protocol is going to be similar to what it was last year with a few notable changes. Probably the biggest one is the maximum number of hives that were allowed last year was 1,000. This year we're going to allow up to 1,500. Hives are still only permitted to go to Cumberland County, same as last year. And some biosecurity measures were modified a little bit, just to adapt to changing biosecurity threats and evolving economic thresholds. Same as last year, inspections have to occur in the province of origin before being permitted to come here, and then we're going to look at them again as well. I don't know exactly what percentage we're going to look at, but I think it's kind of to be determined. And then I did see that a copy of the import protocol went out in your guys' newsletter, I think this week or last week. But it's on our website as well, and if you want a copy, you can reach out to me and I can send it to you as well. So my last couple slides here are just some challenges, some opportunities. Some of the challenges on the horizon for the honeybee industry, climate change certainly. I know you guys know that all too well. But climate change is impacting all aspects of beekeeping in the province. Beekeepers are going to have to learn to adapt, and I think they're doing a pretty good job right now. So I don't think there'll be any major challenges, I guess. Some of the challenges, certainly not limited to. We're seeing changes in pollination time. Pollination gets earlier and earlier, it seems, every year. Changing in intensity of honey flows is changing. Pest pressure is certainly changing. It's getting worse. And then changes in overwintering as well. Lower honey yields is one, as I mentioned, the past 3 or 4 years we've been seeing, where the yield's been consistently down, 20 or 22%. And that's something, honey yield is something that beekeepers rely on. So if that's, starts to be the trend that our average yield is closer to 40 pounds and 50 pounds a hive, then beekeepers are going to have to find some way to make up that lost revenue, certainly. Pests and disease are becoming a big problem as well. The current pests that we have are becoming more challenging to control. For example, we're seeing new things like new strains, atypical strains of a European foul brood, which is more aggressive and doesn't respond very well or at all to antibiotics. And because European foul brood is a stress-related disease, it's often linked to blueberry pollination. If it ever makes its way here, it's certainly going to be a challenge that beekeepers are going to have to contend with. We're starting to see resistance of mites to synthetic miticides, so beekeepers are going to have to figure out a way to kind of stick handle that. There's exotic pests of concern. There's a new pest on the horizon called the Tropilalops mite, or Tropy for short. And it's kind of making its way from southeastern Asia towards Europe. And I guess if it, in the countries, I guess, that it's been introduced into, it's, wreaked complete havoc and devastated the industries there. So if it ever finds its way here, it's going to be a very challenging one for us to work with. But I think, not all doom and gloom. In Nova Scotia, it's very commendable to see that, Nova Scotia beekeepers are kind of taking the bull by the horns and trying to get ahead of the curve here. So, beekeepers, realize these things are kind of coming and are trying to put the stopgaps in place so that if, potentially when they come, we're in a good position to kind of handle it. And then change the pollination. We talked about this quite a bit. Earlier timing, longer duration sometimes, variable weather during pollination. I know that affects, pollination success, but it impacts honeybees as well. So if they're kind of locked up in the hives for longer, if they can't get out because of the rain or cold weather or whatever, it's harder on the bees as well. But there's a lot of opportunities in the bee industry also. The industry is growing, which is great to see. We have more bees going into winter in 2025 than any time in history. And then looking back last year, 2024 broke the record for the most hives ever operated in Nova Scotia, which is great. Nova Scotia beekeepers are increasing self-sustainability through overwintering nukes and local queen production, which is awesome because self-sustainability helps buffer higher winter losses. And if, beekeepers have more bees than they have, demand for pollination, they're able to sell those, which is an extra revenue stream. There's more beekeepers who are sending bees to pollination. Most of that increase, majority of those, 20 new people are smaller scale beekeepers, but, everyone starts somewhere. And if you look at, the biggest beekeepers in the province, most of them started by sending just, a half-ton truckload of bees to blueberries. So, everyone's got to start somewhere. So if, someone approaches you, I guess, just looking to rent, 5 or 10 hives, you give them a shot. They can take that revenue. Maybe they want to expand, and we may get another larger scale commercial beekeeper in the province, which is I guess what we need. And there is increasing interest and desire of beekeepers to send bees to pollination, which is great too. Certainly we're seeing the numbers increase, but there's even more people that are reaching out to me trying to find ways to get their bees out in blueberries and wondering, what they should do, if the blueberries are hard on the bees, stuff like that. So I mean that's a positive thing. So certainly knowledge, education, and extension are needed to help give beekeepers help to get their hives in the fields. Ada's doing a pretty good job of this already, and I think there's still room to grow on that. And then beekeeping mentors are going to be very important too. So some of the larger scale commercial beekeepers that have been doing it for a long time, they've learned a lot of efficiencies, I guess, that some of the new up-and-comers, if they can kind of pass that knowledge along, I think it'll be very beneficial. So hopefully I didn't go too far over time. I can take any questions you may have right now, but if not, I'm around till about lunchtime, so come find me. Yes, Neil.
I can't get away without a couple questions. Can we go back to your first slide where you broke down the beekeepers in the different hive categories?
Sure. There.
Yeah. For the category over 500, I noticed the number of hives in July was 18,000.
Yes.
Then the number of hives to pollination was like 13, almost 14.
Yes.
It's quite a big discrepancy, and I would have thought anybody with over 500 hives would have put them all out to pollination. Do you know why there's such a difference there?
Yes, yeah. So the number of hives in July, so that's a little bit higher, I guess, than the number of hives that would, may potentially be going to blueberries. So the number of hives in July is kind of the peak number. So that would include generally the hives that you would send to blueberries, or that they would send to blueberries, plus their summer splits, which are their new hives for, replacement of winter losses ahead of time or whatever. So that's why there's a bit of a discrepancy there.
Okay.
Good question.
Yeah. Now this may be beyond the scope of your duties, but there's a lot of bumblebee quads being brought into the province now.
Yep.
Are you tracking those at all? And or do you have any idea, based on your knowledge of pollination and bees and so on, how the cost per pound of pollination compares bumblebees versus honeybees?
Yeah, to answer the first question, so for the numbers, we don't track how many quads come into the province. Um, but I guess loosely, there's certainly more now than there has been. Um, Something I think, that I see kind of on my excursions around looking at honeybees is I don't think that we're using the quads in a very practical or effective way. I think, understanding the biology of the different pollinators, we can do a better job at, leveraging the pollination resources that we have. But I see a lot, they come in the yellow crates or whatever. I see a lot of them just kind of like stuck beside honeybee hives, and the quads just kind of stay there where honeybees will travel upwards of 5 kilometers, but more likely, a kilometer or two to pollinate. And bumblebees don't really go that far. So it would be, certainly spreading the bumblebees out, I think would be a lot more effective. Or growers will see a lot better pollination success just because you're kind of, matching the biology of the pollinator to, the needs of the pollination. I can't remember. Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Just wondering how the pollination cost per pound of bumblebees versus honeybees.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's, certainly people that will maybe more qualified than me to speak on that. But there's lots of numbers thrown around that a quad is worth a honeybee hive, or a quad is perhaps worth more than a honeybee hive. Um, I think it's hard to kind of rely on one explicitly. Maybe I think all pollinators have their benefits, and they certainly all have their disadvantages. But I think they work very well together. They certainly do complement each other. But I guess in terms of the economics of are bumblebees more economical to get a pound of berries versus honeybees? I think some of that research is out there. And maybe someone else will be better qualified to speak on it. But there's a new paper that was released by Pierre Giovinazzo's team at the University of Laval, and I think it came out maybe the end of December, beginning of January. And it'll be an interesting one to have a look at because they did like a 5-year pollination study over like 170 fields in Quebec. And some of the stuff I guess that you're asking about, some of that information's in there. And it's a pretty large scale study, so certainly I think their conclusions would be fairly valid looking at that many hives over that many years, sorry, that many fields over that many years.
You mentioned that placement is very important with respect to the quads as well.
Yep. And honeybees, I guess.
And honeybees
Yep.
too. As far as them being in the same field, any idea how far we should be putting them apart? So I don't know if they interfere with each other or not in the field.
I mean, I think they can interfere with each other. I don't know what I think the producers of the quads, they have kind of their own guidelines, but certainly I think you'd want to be a couple 100 meters away from honeybee hives just to reduce any chances of negative impacts.
Okay, thanks.
Welcome.
Sawyer, in your opinion, why is New Brunswick and the Western Canada seem to have a lot higher winter losses?
Yep. So they have certainly their own challenges. I guess we're lucky in a way. I can't really necessarily speak to New Brunswick. I think their higher loss that they had was due to a drought that they had that year. But in Western Canada, they're kind of the first ones to see all these problems. So, the atypical European foul brood showed up out west first. The mites resistant to synthetic miticides showed up out west first. So they're kind of dealing with some of those problems. And we're lucky in a sense, I guess, because we can kind of learn from them, I guess. They found kind of ways. They found, I guess, some ways to manage. I mean, obviously, looking at the numbers, their losses are still high. But we can certainly learn some from them. But I guess, yeah, I don't know. I'd like to think that Nova Scotia beekeepers are just doing a bang-up job. You know, I don't necessarily know exactly, how, they manage bees at West. I know things are a little bit different, certainly. But, when I look at Nova Scotia beekeepers, we're very pleased with what people are doing. I think, for such a small province and, typically, the Maritimes are, kind of trailing behind the West in some things. I think, Nova Scotia beekeepers are kind of right up there or kind of leading the pack in some of these things. So, I think, overall as an industry, we're just doing a great job. Anything else? Thanks.